Hello and welcome to this tutorial. Today I'm going to demonstrate my pattern for this slip stitch oval, meant to be a placemat. This oval is constructed in 10 wedges using slip stitch crochet. So in this diagram, the first wedge you make is number 1, and then they're numbered sequentially in the order in which they are worked. So this slip stitch method creates these unique columns of V's that look a little bit like knitting, as shown here on the right side of the work. They are created by working back and forth in rows, and the rule is that you always work regular slip stitch on the right side of the work and yarn over slip stitch on the wrong side. And it's that combination of rows that creates this unique look. That rule holds throughout the entire pattern. However, in order to create these triangular shaped wedges, we will be using a simple short row technique in which every second row you leave 2 stitches unworked at the end of the row, and so this creates progressively shorter columns, and that is what makes these triangular. Now, wedges numbers 1, 3 to 6, and 8 to 10, so in other words, everything except wedges 2 and 7 are all worked identically using slip stitch short rows in which the 2 stitches are left unworked on the right side slip stitch rows. Wedges 2 and 7 are worked backwards, these central ones here. These are what create the oval shape. And these ones are worked the opposite way. You work the short rows on the wrong side, yarn over slip stitch side of the project. And that is the only way in which these wedges are different. Otherwise, they are worked identically. So I'm going to be using worsted cotton for this project. You can use anything, but I am using Wool & the Gang's Happy Shiny Cotton because it's really soft and beautiful. And I do recommend a 5mm hook. Any worsted craft cotton would work for this pattern. So we're going to start by chaining 25 times. I do realize that the blue background and blue yarn is probably not a great choice here, so eventually I do change that. Once we finish our 25 chain, we are going to start by working yarn over slip stitches. And we're going to work those into the back bumps of the chain, starting as we usually do with the second bump from the hook. So yarn over, insert the hook into the back bump, and pull up a loop. But then instead of yarning over again, like you would normally do to complete most crochet stitches, you're just going to pull that working loop right through the other loops on the hook. So that's one worked. Let's do it again. Yarn over, insert the hook into the back bump, pull up a loop, and then pull that loop through the other 2 loops. So always pulling through all loops on the hook. Now you'll notice that there I actually turn my hook away from myself and pull through the last 2 loops that way. Now I do that because I actually find this stitch to be a little bit difficult to work sometimes. When you are pulling the working loop through the last 2 loops, that middle loop, which is actually the yarn over, is kind of tensioned in a way that it's hard to pull it through that way. But if you turn it towards the back, I find it's more wide open and it's a lot easier to pull through. You don't have to work the stitch that way. It does not affect the construction of the stitch. It's just something that I've adapted to doing because I find it easier. It is a bit of a 2-step because you work the yarn over and then you sort of turn the hook to complete the stitch. So it does turn it into a sort of a 2-step thing, but I do find that it really helps me. Again, you don't have to work the stitch that way if you don't want to. So we are going to work this yarn over slip stitch 24 times, which, if we've counted correctly, should bring us right to the beginning of our starting chain. So at this point, I just want to mention the kind of different convention that I'm using here in my notation. So the notations on the bottom left of your screen correspond to the way I've written the pattern in the PDF, which, by the way, is available on my website using the link in the description. It is a free pattern, so I do encourage you to go and grab it at some point. It'll really help you work through this to have those written instructions with you. But in that pattern, I do use the convention of numbering the rows such that each row is actually 2 rows. So 1 row in the pattern is actually going over and back. And so they correspond to the columns rather than the actual number of rows. It simplified the notation. So I've worked yarn over slip stitches all the way to the end, 24 in total. Now I chain one and I turn. I do recommend consistently, at least if you're a beginner to this type of crochet, always turning counterclockwise for now. Now, for this row and throughout the pattern, we are always going to only work into the back loops of our stitches. So here you see this is the back loop and this is sort of the front loop. That's what I call them anyway. So that's the back loop. So it's very important that you figure out where that is in your own work and always work into the back loop, and that is consistent throughout the whole pattern. So our next row is going to be worked in regular slip stitch, so no more yarn overs, and it is going to be our first short row. So we're only going to work 22 out of our 24 available stitches, which means that at the end of this row, we will leave 2 stitches unworked. I'm not going to count them out loud, just number them on the screen so that I don't mess up your counting. So regular slip stitches, and this is a bit fiddly at first. You just don't have much fabric to hold on to, but it does get easier as you go. And you see I eventually start speeding up a little bit. So at first, you'll probably want to make sure you count your stitches carefully. But once you get used to this method, you will be able to easily recognize when you only have 2 stitches remaining at the end. So there, I almost worked it, but there's 2 stitches remaining. We're going to leave those unworked. Sometimes I call that abandoning those stitches. Chain 1, turn. We always chain 1 when we turn. And when we start a new row, we do not work into the turning chain, so it doesn't count as a stitch. There, I've changed to a green background. I don't know if it's better or not, but here we go. So now our next row is not a short row. We're now on the wrong side of the work. We're going to work yarn over slip stitches, and we're going to go all the way back to the beginning. So that's what I mean when I say this is not a short row. We're not going to leave 2 stitches unworked. At the end of this row, we're going to work all the way back to the beginning. First few stitches are a little tricky. Do take some time to make sure that you're actually working into the first stitch of the row, that you're not working into the turning chain, but you're also not skipping the first stitch, because sometimes I find it's easy to do that. And like I said, I will probably stop specifically saying chain 1, turn, but just remember that every time you turn in this project, you always chain 1. We will work quite a few rows of this first wedge together, but once things start becoming very repetitive, I will skip ahead. So remember, don't leave 2 unworked at the end. Work this one all the way to the end, because in this first wedge, the short rows are only worked on the slip stitch side. So we're doing yarn over slip stitch. So remember, that means we always go right to the end. So those last few stitches were a bit messy looking, but basically I worked all the way to the end, chain 1, turn. So now you can see what's emerging here. That is the right side, and this is the wrong side. So it becomes pretty obvious which side you're on, and that can really help orient you to where you are in the pattern if you forget. The rule is, on the right side, once again, we always work slip stitch. And on the wrong side, we work yarn over slip stitch, and that applies to all of the wedges. So we're on the right side, so we're going to work slip stitch, and we know that in wedge number 1, our slip stitch rows are where we leave 2 stitches unworked at the end. So we're only going to now work 20. We have 22 stitches available. We're only going to work 20 of them. So here we are at the end, 2 stitches left. Don't work those. Here's what they look like. Hopefully you can easily identify them in your own work so that you can basically at this point stop counting stitches. But definitely do count if you're not sure. Sometimes I find in crochet, the end of a round or the end of a row can be a little bit weird as far as like what is a stitch and what is the turning chain, and and all of that. So once you get used to what things look like in your own work, you should be able to stop counting and just make sure that you always leave 2 stitches unworked on the right side slip stitch rows. So this is a yarn over slip stitch row. We're working 20 all the way back to the beginning. My numbers got a little off there. Chain 1 and turn. Now you can see we're on the right side. So we're going to work another short row, 18 stitches this time, leaving 2 unworked at the end. And we're working in regular slip stitch. So we're just going to continue doing this, and every second row we're going to decrease the number of stitches we're working by 2 until eventually we are only going to have a handful of stitches left. And it's not confusing. Nothing really changes at the end, but when I do skip ahead, I will make sure that I show you sort of the last few rows to work, just so that you know, because that's where you can get hung up, I think, is transitioning from one wedge to the next wedge. So we'll make sure that we do those parts together for the first few wedges. So now we're working our yarn over slip stitch row, which means we go all the way to the end. We don't leave any stitches unworked. So we're flying along here. I'm working a short row in regular slip stitch, so that means that I leave 2 unworked at the end. So I have 3 left here. Work 1 more for number 16, chain 1 and turn, and that brings us to the wrong side. So we will work 16 yarn over slip stitches all the way back to the beginning. So I am going to skip ahead at this point because everything is very repetitive. Just keep working those short rows until you only have 6 stitches remaining. So you might want to just pause the video and do that work. I'm going to do it off camera. So I've now completed row 9, which means I've worked over and back across 6 stitches. So now I'm ready to work my slip stitch short row consisting of just 4 stitches, and leaving 2 of the 6 remaining unworked. Chain 1 and turn. Now we're on the wrong side, so that means we yarn over slip stitch all the way back over those 4 stitches. Chain 1 and turn. And our final short row is going to be just 2 stitches long. So here's where you just need to keep your wits about you. I find it can get a little confusing. So slip stitch 2, chain 1 and turn, and then as always you have to yarn over slip stitch 2 in order to complete that column. So here's 1, struggling a bit, and then yarn over slip stitch a second time. Now you're at the beginning or the end, chain 1 and turn. Now what we are going to do, the final row of this wedge, is we are going to work all the way down in a diagonal. Here we have our 2 stitches that are at the top of this column, and then we have 2 unworked stitches along the side of all of the columns going down across these steps. In order to avoid creating a gap in the fabric, we need to pick up some loops as we go over these steps. So the loop I just showed you, this one here, it's adjacent to the big wide open loop that comes right off the side of the column. Hopefully you can find that. That is, I believe, what a lot of people recommend picking up as we work down over these steps. So there it is there. I'll show it to you on the next column. It's this little loop that wraps around that broad ladder between your columns. That loop is actually the back bump of the turning chain. So some people will recommend you pick up that loop. I actually don't do that. What I do is I go into the tip of my column here. There's a bit of a jumbled mess. And I go into a space that's just a couple of crossed stitches below the tip. I don't know if it helps you to look at it backwards, probably not, but hopefully you can find that space in your own work. If you can't and you don't know what I'm doing, feel free to just pick up that loop I showed you, which is the back bump of your turning chain. But I find this, sticking your hook in here, makes it a little bit neater looking. And I will remind you that if you did clockwise turns instead of counterclockwise turns, the tips of your columns will look slightly different. And later in the pattern, I will demonstrate that. But for now, I would ask that you just do clockwise or counterclockwise turns with me so that our work looks the same, just to simplify the teaching. So let's start this 24 slip stitch row. We're of course going to start by working across the top 2 slip stitches in the normal way. Then we are going to insert the hook into that space, so either pick up the back bump or insert where I'm inserting, if you can figure that out. Then here are your 2 unworked stitches from the next column. We're going to insert the hook into the first one, back loop only as always, and work a slip stitch through all the loops on the hook. So that is your 3rd slip stitch of this row. Then we're going to work the 4th into the next slip stitch in the normal way. So let's do that again. That is where we are going to insert our hook. That is the first of our 2, and that's the second of our 2 slip stitches that we're actually going to work. So insert the hook into whatever spot you're using, and then insert into the back loop of the next slip stitch of the next column, and yarn over and pull through all loops on the hook. Then work the next one as normal. Okay, so just keep doing that. Insert and work down the line. I'm going to show you just doing the last couple. So there's the second of the column. Here I am inserting my hook across the step, and then there's 2 slip stitches left that I have to work. So I'm going to work the first one together with all those loops, and then the last slip stitch is just worked normal. So if you're confident here that you've done everything right, you don't have to count, but if you're not sure, you might want to count and make sure you have exactly 24 stitches here, because it is important to start off the next wedge with the correct number. So now wedge number 2 is worked differently. The techniques are the same, but we're going to do things backwards. And this is in order to make the triangle point in the opposite direction to create an oval shape. To accomplish that, as I mentioned before, we're going to work the short rows on the yarn over slip stitch rows instead of the slip stitch. So we have the wrong side facing at this point. We're going to start with yarn over slip stitches as usual, but we're going to make this a short row. So our row currently consists of 24 stitches. We're only going to work 22 of them. We're going to leave the last 2 unworked. So it's exactly the same techniques. It's just working the short rows on the yarn over slip stitch wrong side rows instead of the way you did it in wedge 1, which is you worked them on the slip stitch rows. And that is the only difference. So you're going to proceed through the rows in exactly the same way. Every second row, you're going to decrease the length of your row by 2 stitches. So it'll go starting, the first short row always has 22 stitches, then 20, then 18, 16, 14, etc. until you complete over and back the row that has only 2 stitches. Obviously, you can't work a row that has 0 stitches. So you know once you finish over and back the row that has 2 stitches, you know you're finished the wedge and it's time to work your long diagonal edge. And we will do that together for this wedge for sure, because it is done in a slightly different way. So here I am. I have worked 22 yarn over slip stitches. I'm leaving the last 2 unworked. That is called a short row. Chain 1 turn. Now I'm back to the right side. So I know by convention I will always be working slip stitch. And in this wedge, the slip stitch rows are not short rows. So work all the way to the end. So that means in this case 22 stitches. We don't leave any unworked on the slip stitch rows. So I've really knocked that into you, I think, at this point. Hopefully you understand what I'm driving at and can probably proceed to complete this wedge on your own. But we will continue to work a few more rows together just in case that might be helpful. After working the first wedge, you might be inclined to leave 2 stitches unworked because you're working slip stitch, but just remember this wedge is different and we work all the way to the end in slip stitch, and then when we do the wrong side yarn over slip stitch rows, that's when we decrease by 2 stitches. So now we'll work 20 stitches and leave 2 unworked. Like I said, if you are having trouble or would appreciate some written instructions to have with you to accompany the video, do go to my website. It is a free pattern. You do have to give your email, but that's just so that you can be sent the download link. I do not send promotional emails, even if you sign up for them. Unfortunately, my website's business plan became too expensive for me to have the option to send promotional emails. So I simply don't email anyone other than to send you the download link. So feel free to take this free pattern. So here we are working on the right side in slip stitch. So this is not a short row. Go all the way to the end and work 20 stitches. If I am working faster than you, you will have to just pause the video to catch up, and I apologize for that. Don't be tempted to leave those unworked. Work all the way to the end. And this is a short row, so we will only work 18 stitches and leave 2 unworked at the end. And leaving 2 unworked and going back to the right side. So here you will see that we are creating a straight edge on one end and a stepped diagonal edge on the other, and it is simply the opposite end to the way we did that in wedge 1. So go ahead and continue working those short rows until, like I did before, I'm just going to show you the last few rows. So stop at the end of row 9, which means you should have 6 stitches and you've worked them over and back. If you want to figure out where you are in the pattern, you can count the columns. So if you count these up, if you're on row 9, then you should have 9. And that is the 9th row. So we have finished the 9th row and there are 6 stitches remaining. You can count them there. So that's just a way that you can figure out where you are in the pattern if you put it down and come back to it later, or if you're like me and you just lose track of what you're doing right in the middle of doing it. So now we are going to work our wrong side yarn over slip stitch row, which is a short row. So you always leave 2 stitches unworked at the end. So we had 6, that means we work 4, chain 1, turn. Now we're back on the right side and we'll work slip stitches all the way to the end. So another 4 stitches. Chain 1, turn, and now we will do the short little row that only has 2 stitches, starting with the yarn over slip stitch short row where we leave 2 stitches unworked. Chain 1, turn, and then we always have to complete each column by going back to the beginning. So in this case, slip stitch back to the beginning. So we have almost completed our wedge. Row 12, as it was on the first wedge, is this sort of more complicated row where we have to work down the diagonal across these steps. So as before, we have 2 stitches on the top, and then we have 2 unworked stitches at the edge of each of these stepped columns. This time though, we are on the wrong side of the work, so we're going to do it a little bit differently. It's more important in this, according to the Bosnian ladies who taught me this technique, you leave gaps in the fabric if you don't pick up 2 loops here. So I'm going to show you which loops I pick up. One of them is this very obvious sort of horizontal bar that you should have if you're doing counterclockwise turns. From the right side, it's really easy to see that, and you can see that it's kind of disruptive. It doesn't look very good. So the reason for picking it up is so that we actually kind of get it out of the way and work it into our edge column. So there it is. It's very easy to see on the right side if you just flip the work over. So, but it's a sort of a big horizontal loop. Then the loop immediately to the right of that is the other one that we're going to pick up. So there's the first one that I've been showing you, and sort of adjacent to and connected to that is the other loop that we're going to pick up across our steps. So 1 and 2, we're going to pick up both of those loops as we go. I've got my chain twisted around there. That's still twisted, but anyway, so work, slip stitch. Oh, and the other thing I want to tell you is that we are going to work this row in slip stitch. Now, technically we are on the wrong side, so we should be working yarn over slip stitch, but it doesn't make much difference to the appearance, so I recommend simplifying things by just working slip stitch for this row. So we've worked the first 2. Now we're going to pick up those 2 sort of horizontal loops at the end of the next column, or the column that we just worked actually. And then we're going to, as we did before, identify the next stitch of the first stitch of the next column that remains unworked, and work all of those loops together as a slip stitch. That can be a bit challenging, and you see that I twist my hook around halfway through to make it easier. So let's do that again together. There's our 2 loops that we're going to pick up. So insert the hook into the first one. Really would help if I had a longer thumbnail. And then into the second one. So we've got 2 loops on the hook, or 3. Then we're going to insert the hook into the first of the next 2 unworked stitches, yarn over, and pull through all loops on the hook. Then don't forget to work that second unworked stitch, just using a regular slip stitch. Now, I had trouble getting into that, so I wonder if I actually did a clockwise turn for that column. So yes, I can tell when I'm picking up these loops that I definitely created that column at the end of it by doing a clockwise turn. Now here I'm making a mistake. I'm actually working those loops separately as their own stitch. Don't do that. So I realize in time and I undo that. You will add a stitch or increase by a stitch if you do that, so don't do it. So you're simply picking up those 2 loops and then working them together with the next unworked stitch on the side of the next column. And then you work the second one separately. Again, pick up your 2 sort of horizontal loops and work them together with the next stitch, and then work the second normally. So just keep doing that all the way down the line, and a good way to make sure that you've done everything correctly at the end of this row is to count your stitches. You should have exactly 24, and this is one of those times where if you don't have 24, you may want to investigate to see what you did wrong, because you don't want to start the next wedge with the wrong number of stitches. So the only times in the project that we will be doing this very specific wrong side stepped technique is in wedges 2, and then again halfway around the placemat in wedge number 7. All of the other ones are worked as for wedge 1, so the short rows are done on slip stitch, they're done on the right side of the work, and then when you're working this long diagonal row, you are on the right side. So you just insert the hook into that spot that I showed you, and you don't have to worry about picking up these 2 loops. This is just because we're working on the wrong side. So here is a case where I definitely did a clockwise turn, okay? The 2 loops just look a little bit different. This first one in particular is very vertically oriented, and it's a little bit harder to pick up. I'm going to get into more detail later in the video to show you the difference between your counterclockwise and clockwise turns. In many patterns, it really doesn't matter, but in these slip stitch patterns, it makes things look different, and I will demonstrate that. So we're picking up 2 loops for the last time, working the second last slip stitch together with those loops, and then finally working the very last slip stitch, which is the last unworked stitch on your last column. So again, double check to make sure you have 24. I'm going to do this because I had a few slips there, quickly counting. So in fact, I do have 24, so I'm quite pleased, and I can move on to wedge number 3. Now, wedge number 3 is worked identically to wedge 1, and we're going to work a bunch of sequential wedges in this same way. So we're going to go back to working short rows on the slip stitch right side rows. So there's our 2 wedges that we've completed. So starting wedge number 3, we are on the right side, so we're going to work slip stitch, and we're going to make that a short row, which means that we're only going to work 22 stitches, because remember we have 24, so we're going to leave 2 unworked at the end. And then just carry on in that way. I don't think I need to demonstrate any more of these identical wedges for you. They are all the same. You work slip stitch short rows on the right side, and on the wrong side you work complete rows, where you go all the way to the end in yarn over slip stitch. And you do that until you only have 2 stitches remaining, making sure that you complete that last 2 stitch column by going over and back. So here we are. I'll just demonstrate the edge of, or the end of wedge 3 again, stopping at this place where we have 6 stitches remaining, starting with our slip stitch row on the right side and working 4 stitches, always abandoning 2 stitches on our slip stitch rows. Then on our yarn over slip stitch rows, working all the way back to the beginning. And then working the short little fiddly row that is only 2 stitches long, slip stitch, chain 1, turn, and then yarn over slip stitch all the way back across those 2 stitches. And chain 1, turn. Now again, we're on the right side, so we're going to work down the diagonal and over the steps in the same way that we worked the first one. So start by working across the first 2 stitches in the normal way using slip stitch. Then we're going to insert, I call this kind of like the heart of the tip of the column there. It's kind of an odd space to explain, but basically there's like 2 crossed stitches above the hook in that location where I insert it. And I've tried it all different ways, and I just find that that gives you the neatest looking join, I guess, between your diagonal row and your columns that come up to meet it. I think I might do a separate video at some point showing all the different combinations and permutations of how you can do this and trying to figure out which one looks best. The bottom line is that it doesn't make a huge difference. I find there's a little bit of messiness at that join with pretty much any way that you do this, but I do prefer this way slightly to the way that, for example, if you Google how you should do this, it'll usually tell you that you should just pick up the loop that is the back bump of the turning chain, which again is a very different place from where I'm inserting the hook. So I've worked the last one. I should have 24 stitches. Chain 1 and turn. And to start the next wedge, because we're working 2 identical wedges consecutively, we're going to work an extra row of yarn over slip stitch all the way to the end, so a long row, 24 stitches. We need to do that because on this wedge, as in the previous, our short rows are worked on the slip stitch side, and we are currently on the yarn over slip stitch side, so we don't want to work a short row here. We want to work all the way to the end. So just work this 1 extra row of yarn over slip stitch 24 times, and then turn, and you will be on the right side, and you can start working short rows. So of course, every short row, every wedge starts with 22 stitches and goes down by 2 every time. So I'm going to let you work 4, 5, and 6 off camera. They are all identical to the instructions there for wedge 4. Once you have finished wedge 6, wedge 7 is worked exactly as wedge number 2, so you can go right into short rows at the beginning by working a yarn over slip stitch row and only working 22 stitches, and then turning. Now for simplicity, I've just written turn here, but always chain 1 turn. So for wedge 7, the short rows are worked on the yarn over slip stitch wrong side, but otherwise you're doing exactly the same thing until you get to those last 2 stitches. Then you work on the wrong side this time, your long slip stitch row across your steps. Then wedges 8 to 10 are worked as for wedge 1. So slip stitch short rows on the right side, and you work your last long row, row 12, in the usual way, where you are working from the right side. So hopefully that is clear as mud. I again recommend the PDF if you're confused, and because it does give instructions for all the wedges. Now we are basically finished. We have finished wedge 10. So we've worked 3 consecutive identical wedges, and we're going to join it to our first wedge, which was worked the same way. Now, cut the yarn, leaving about a 30-centimeter tail. That should be adequate. We've got to do a bit of sewing here, and you may know from my previous videos I'm very bad at finishing. It's not my forte. So here's 1 semicircle. There's the 2 atypical wedges in the middle, 2 and 7, and then there's 4 identical ones in a row at the other end. And we have to make a join. So because of where you leave off at the end of row 12 of wedge 10, your yarn is actually in the middle here. So just pull it through, thread it onto a tapestry needle, and then we'll have to use a separate piece to sew the middle seam. So you can sew the middle seam now, but what I'm going to do is sew the seam between wedge 1 and 10 first. So fold it so that the right sides are facing each other, which I think is what I'm doing there. Actually, I have the wrong sides facing each other there. Is that what I should be doing? So do as I say and not as I do. So I'm just going to whip stitch this together. It's very simple, but I think it's probably better if you actually put the right sides facing each other and the wrong sides facing out. But honestly, I don't think it makes much difference. So what I'm doing here is I'm looking at the edge at that nice neat row of V's that runs up the sides of both wedges, and I'm whip stitching. Now I go off camera a bit here. I will fix that in a second, but I'm basically just putting my needle in to the lower loop or the lower arm of the lower fabric of V's, and then the upper of the top fabric. So in other words, I'm leaving the middle arms of those V's untouched, and it's important to do that because it will look better on the other side if you leave a row of V's intact. So in other words, I don't recommend going through both arms of the V. Just go through one on the top and one on the bottom and make it be the outer arms, and leaving the middle ones that touch each other unworked. Again, I am no wizard with finishing, but this is how I do it. There are other ways. You could probably do Kitchener stitch or mattress stitch and maybe make it look even better, but this is so quick and simple, and I find that it's good enough. So here we have the right side. I'm still not sure which way I did this, but maybe it doesn't matter that much. Just tighten it as much as you can without puckering it. If you do pucker it, just stretch it back out. And we'll, just have a look here. I mean, it's not that bad. It looks a little different than the natural sort of seam that occurred between 2 wedges that were worked together. So there it is. But it's really not that bad. So for me, it's good enough for government. I think after blocking, you'd be hard-pressed to really be able to tell which of those was sewn together. So unfortunately for the center seam, we need to cut a new piece of yarn. I recommend maybe a 30 or 40 centimeter long yarn here. And this time I'm going to do it right, I think, and put the right sides together. But first we're going to start by sewing together our little semicircle at the end. So identify the 4 long rows of those 4 identical wedges on the semicircle. They should be fairly obvious. They're just like the last or the first column of each of these wedges. We just kind of need to cinch those together. And where I insert the needle is approximately the same place where I insert it when I'm working down over the steps. So not right on the edge, but maybe picking up 2 or 3 loops at the tip of each of these columns. And you're, again, working into row 12. You're working into the long columns that point towards the center of your semicircle. I think that'll be fairly obvious if you look at your own work. And just tighten it, but leave it a long enough tail to weave in at the end. Then fold things, bring it through to the other side. Fold things so that your right sides are facing and so that you're looking at the wrong side. So here I do that correctly. And don't worry about making it too tight there because you can tighten it using your yarn tail at the end. So now we're going to once again whip stitch this together. This is a different edge. So here I'm going to show you a little bit more closely in a second what I'm actually doing, but what I'm doing is I'm sewing 2 stitches per column, which is more than adequate, and I'm going into 2 very specific places that we're going to use again later when we do the border. So there's a natural hole that exists between the columns, so I'm going into that, and then I'm also going into that same horizontal loop that is sort of at the very end of the columns and is quite conspicuous looking. So here I am going through the natural hole between columns, and here I will show you that horizontal loop at the very tip of the columns. Where is it? There it is. So that is how I sew this together. Again, there are probably many ways to do this, many of which may look much better than what I'm doing. So I really should not be teaching this. I'm terrible at sewing. And this is just the quickest and easiest way to cinch this together. So going into the space between and going into each column, pretty much on the very tip. And once we get down to the other semicircle end, we'll do the same thing again, where we sort of, tighten it a bit first, I guess. But then we're going to just turn around to the right side so that we can see, like, you still have quite a hole there where those 4 wedges come together on the semicircle end. So we're just going to grab, in a similar way to the other end, all 4 of those column tips that all point like spokes on a tire. They kind of radiate out from this central point, and tighten it good and firm so that you close that hole. So let's have a look. I mean, it's not perfect once again, but I think after blocking and putting a nice border on, it's good enough for me. If you have a better way to do this, please let me know in the comments, because that center seam is not great. If you wanted, you could run a line of slip stitch down that and neaten it up a little bit, but I'm not going to do that. So there's a few different ways to make a border here. The first one I'm going to show you is, I think, really pretty. It's worked in the same kind of slip stitch technique, but all the borders start with working a foundation row of slip stitch all the way around. So we'll do that first. Now the way to go here is to work 2 slip stitches per column, and the way I do that is to use this same familiar horizontal loop at the tip of each column, and then this nice natural hole that occurs between the columns. So those are the 2 places that we will work into. Hopefully you can easily identify this. Like I said, if you're not doing counterclockwise turns, your edge might look a little different. The key is just work neatly into consistent spaces each time, and do it in such a way that you have 2 stitches for every column. So work into the column and then work into the space between 2 columns. And work slip stitch. I don't recommend yarn over slip stitch here. It looks quite messy. I just do regular slip stitch all the way around. And that means that you should end up working exactly 24 slip stitches per wedge. And there's 8 wedges, so you should end up with around 192 stitches. Now, there's one caveat to that. On the straight side of the placemat, so this is like somewhere on the semicircle, and so things are quite normal. And we just simply have 1 stitch per column and 1 stitch in between each column. But once we get around to this sort of valley that occurs where wedges 2 and 7 have their apex, I want you to not pick up any stitches in wedges 2 or 7. So you just complete 24 slip stitches for the previous wedge. So that's like a conventional wedge. And just remember where you finished off. So there I just worked into that column. Now I'm working into the space between 2 columns. That should be stitch number 24 for that wedge. just skip right over the apex of wedge number 2 or 7, depending on which side you're on. Don't pick up any stitches there, and go right to the first column of the next wedge. So that will be what allows you to have 192 stitches at the end, because you basically are only picking up stitches in 8 wedges, 24 stitches per wedge. And it just works a little bit of a decrease over that little valley there, and it sort of softens that valley a little bit. So here we are at the end. I do recommend, because we're going to work an invisible join, you can sort of not pick up a stitch in the very last space and then work your invisible join, and that actually results in having approximately 191 stitches. But honestly, as I'm going to demonstrate, having the absolute precise number of stitches here is not super important. You should be able to fudge it, especially if you're like a few stitches short, because for some reason in this sample that I made, I only end up with 187 slip stitches. And so here I am doing my invisible join, but I didn't want to make a whole new placemat or do the border again. So I'm going to show you how to finish this border using, the wrong number of stitches. And so you'll see how it can be fudged. So regardless of what type of border, I recommend working into just the top loop of this slip stitch baseline, and I will be referring to that as the baseline as we go. But you can work under both loops if you prefer. So this is the sort of pretty leaf overlapping border we're going to make. It's quite thick. It adds 7 centimeters to the length and width. So there are some simpler borders at around 1 hour, 4 minutes of this video. It's really long. So this complex border starts with a chain 7, and we're only going to do that for this very first motif. Then we're going to work 6 regular slip stitches into the back bumps, as always starting with the second bump from the hook. So working not yarn over slip stitches here, we're just doing regular slip stitch down the back bumps of this little chain. Now the last couple are very fiddly. The chain kind of wants to twist against the placemat. The last one is sort of anyone's guess which loop the back bump is. I mean, not really, but I have trouble finding it. Just pick a loop and work the last slip stitch into it. Then we're going to work 4 slip stitches along our baseline. So we've got this little tail. Don't work into the same stitch that business is coming out of. Go into the next one and work 4 slip stitches. Again, whenever in this pattern I work into the baseline, I work only into the top loop, or I guess that's technically the back loop of those slip stitches. And it just leaves a slightly neater look than if you work under both loops. So chain 1 turn, as we always do, and then we're going to work yarn over slip stitch 8 times. Again, just like we did in the rest of the pattern, we're only going to work into the back loop of the stitch from the previous round or row. So make sure you continue to identify that correctly. Oops, split the yarn. So we're going to work 8 very laborious yarn over slip. Ooh, that's an ugly join. So we're just going to burn right past that, and don't judge me for not cutting that out and fixing it. So this is a bit fiddly because we're now starting to work into our chain once again in a situation where we don't have much fabric to hold on to. I'm really making a meal of this. I think this is the last one to make a total of 8. So you should be leaving 2 stitches unworked on the tip of your chain here. Okay, chain 1 and turn. So next, we are going to work our convex leaf element. So this is a series of stitches of increasing height that will create a nice little curve, and that's what makes it look like a leaf. So we start with a slip stitch, then a yarn over slip stitch, then a single crochet, a half double crochet, a double crochet, and that's the tallest stitch, so that's sort of the apex, then back down to a half double, a single, so it's not perfectly symmetrical, and then a slip stitch. So that is our convex leaf element. Then we are going to work 2 more slip stitches into the baseline, which means we're going over a step. So just like before, we're on the right side, so we work our steps just like we worked right-sided steps. Stick the hook into the column and work the next baseline stitch together in a slip stitch, and then work 1 more slip stitch along the baseline, chain 1 and turn. So now we're on the wrong side again. Same rules apply. On the wrong side, we always work yarn over slip stitch. And this time we're going to work 12. So this is just me making sure I start in the right place. Again, don't ever work into your turning chain, but don't skip the first stitch either. Just make sure you know what you're doing, because the numbers really do matter for these little motifs. So we're going to work a total of 12 yarn over slip stitches. So as you can predict, there's only 10 stitches right now of our motif, so we're going to run out of stitches. So number 11 will be worked across another step, and we're on the wrong side. So remember how we work over a step. So here we are, we're going down over the step. We're going to work yarn over this time, and we're going to pick up 2 of those horizontal loops that I showed you before. Right on the tip of that column, just pick up those 2 loops, keep your yarn over, insert into the next stitch of the motif, which is on our little chain tail, and pull through all loops, and then work 1 final yarn over slip stitch in the very last stitch. So that's a total of 12 yarn over slip stitches. Chain 1 and turn. So we've got this motif that's kind of hanging off into space, and that's deliberate. So now, to finish this motif, we're going to slip stitch 16 here on the right side. And once again, you know that the motif is not 16 stitches long, so we're going to be going over another step. This time, it's stitch number 13 that we should be landing on when we go over the step, and we're on the right side, so remember how we work those steps. We're just going to kind of stick it into my magic spot here that's kind of like the heart of the tip of the column, and then into the next baseline stitch and work them all together in a slip stitch. That was number 13. So this is 14, 15, 16, 17, and 18. And if I said at the beginning of this that we were working 16 stitches, I was wrong. We're supposed to work 18. Chain 1 and turn. Now here marks the beginning of our repeat. So the following instructions we're going to repeat all the way around until we get back to the beginning. The first motif was worked differently, but from now on they're worked exactly the same, starting with 8 yarn over slip stitches here on the wrong side. I think of these 8 as setting up like a nice little shelf for our convex leaf motif. So as we go along here, you'll notice that the first 4 are basically worked on the same motif, but then the next 4 are worked up and over the side of the motif that we just completed. So this is how we kind of have these leaf elements overlapping one another. So work 8, chain 1 and turn. We're back around to the right side, so we're going to work our convex leaf element, starting with a slip stitch, yarn over slip stitch, single crochet, half double, double, half double, single, and slip stitch. And we're at the end, but we now want to work 2 additional slip stitches. The first one is over a step, so we make sure we insert the hook there first, and then work a slip stitch into the next baseline stitch, and then a second slip stitch into the next baseline stitch. Chain 1, turn. Now we're going to yarn over slip stitch 12. Once again, number 11 should be worked over a step, and this is a wrong side step, so we pick up 2 loops in the way that we've been doing all along. Let me just fix my fabric there. At this point, you've got a whole placemat attached to the work here, and you may find it onerous to always be turning in the same direction. So always, like we're turning so often here. These are very short rows. So we will talk about that in a minute and what we can do about it. So here we're going to work a yarn over slip stitch over a step. So pick up 2 loops and then work into the next stitch, back loop only as always, and then pull through all those loops. And then one more regular one to complete 12, chain 1, turn. So now the next instruction is to slip stitch 18. Always only working into the back loops, don't forget that. And if you've done everything correctly, number 13 of these should land over the step. So stitch number 13, so this should be 12. Stitch number 13 is worked in a stepwise manner. Stick your hook through and then through the next stitch of the baseline, and then work number 14, 15. They're tight. I find my baseline stitches are quite tight. What did I say? 15, 16, I think. 17. Oh, okay, I guess that was 18. I miscounted. Chain 1, turn, and then we start the repeat again. So the repeat starts with a yarn over slip stitch 8 times, turn. Remember to always chain 1, turn. I don't bother to type that in. But this is your repeat, so just keep repeating these instructions over and over again until you get all the way around to where you started. While you're doing that, I would like to show you what happens if you turn clockwise. So you see that is a clockwise turn. It creates a slightly different look at the edge of your work, and it creates a slightly different look to the tip of your columns. So I'm just going to zoom through here. I'm doing my yarn over slip stitch 8 on the wrong side, just so that I can show you the difference in terms of what that looks like. So I just did a counterclockwise turn, but that's not what I'm gunning to show you. So I'm just going to zoom through my convex leaf element here. Or maybe I'm just going to work through it at normal speed. There I go. So I just want to show you the difference in terms of what it looks like on the other end. So here's where we did a clockwise turn. And I find it much more difficult to dig out the last stitch of the element there where we did a turn. It's not that bad in that particular example, but it can be quite tight. The other place things look different with a clockwise turn is here. I showed you briefly earlier, but the loop that is actually adjacent to the turning chain of the back bump of the turning chain is actually quite vertically oriented in this version when you do a clockwise turn. It just looks different. And so that is actually the back bump of the turning chain, which technically I think is what you're supposed to pick up. I'll show you what I do. I do my same usual thing, and I just stick the hook right between the 2 arms of the V, sort of into the heart of the tip of the column, and it ends up being directly below that sort of vertically oriented bump when you've done a clockwise turn. And here's what it looks like. It's actually, out of all the options, it's probably the neatest look. It's a pretty unbroken row of V's that goes right to the edge where it joins the upper border. If you look at my counterclockwise turns, they're a bit jumbled up. The row of V's is interrupted by this weird loop here and this whole sort of messed up situation. So after having taught you to do counterclockwise turns, if you want to start doing clockwise, especially on those left edges, it's not a bad idea. But I do recommend on this point over here that you do a counterclockwise turn, because that looks much neater. I've tried it both ways and I don't like the way it looks if you clockwise turn there. So what does this mean? This is basically the rule I recommend. So when you're working the border, when you're turning from the right side to the wrong side, turn clockwise. And when you're turning from the wrong side to the right side, turn counterclockwise, which is like turning the pages of a book. So you don't have to do it this way, but this is how I have decided is the best way to avoid twisting up your fabric and having to untangle your yarn that gets twisted in the body of the placemat and so on. So you can turn back and forth, just using sort of more minimal movements when you're turning the fabric. You can just sort of turn the top part of the fabric because you're just going to be turning it right back, if that makes sense. So there I'm clearly working a column that was turned counterclockwise because it's similar to the way we've been doing things all along. So I'm turning back to the right side, and eventually I'm going to show you what it looks like, whoops, when we are working that left-hand side, left-hand tip that was turned clockwise instead. So here it is. It's a little bit more difficult to get into, and then there on the edge you see this very vertically oriented loop there. There's the back bump of the turning chain, and I just go right below that vertically oriented loop in a very natural space between the arms of the last V and below that vertically oriented loop. And I actually find that out of all the options, like I said, that creates the neatest join, I guess. So there I am turning clockwise because I started on the right side, and when you're on the wrong side, turn counterclockwise. So now I have worked all the way around, and I'm just finishing the convex leaf motif of my very last iteration of the leaf border. I only have a couple of stitches left between the first beginning of the round and where I'm finishing up. Like I said, this is actually not really accurate. I only had 187 stitches. But if this happens to you, I'll show you where to fudge it. If you have the right number of stitches, you can just actually complete the last motif in the usual way, just following the repeat instructions. If you don't have quite enough stitches to do that, don't worry about it. So here's where we finish the leaf motif convex element, and we want to be working 2 slip stitches into the baseline. I don't even have 2 to work with, so I'm just going to work 1. And I'm working it right into the corner of where that first motif joins onto the baseline. Chain 1 turn. So basically we're just trying to like snug the last motif right up under the first one, which is sort of hanging over. So our instructions would say to now work yarn over stitch, slip stitch 12 on the wrong side. Now we don't quite have 12 because we shortchanged ourselves by 1 stitch on the previous one, so now we're going to just work 11. But don't even worry about it. What you need to do is work in yarn over slip stitch until the end of your motif, and then work 2 additional stitches into the previous motif, which is what you're always doing. So here I am working the very last one. So pretend this is stitch number 11 and go down over the step by picking up your 2 loops because you're on the wrong side, and then work a slip stitch into the next slip stitch, and then 1 more into the next, and then chain 1 turn. So then likewise, right now the instructions would say slip stitch 18. No matter how you finished up, you don't have 18 stitches to work with, so just work as many as you have. So go across the top of your motif in slip stitch to complete that motif and make it look the same as the rest of them. So you're just sort of completing the upper border of this last leaf. And then do go down over the step in the usual way. So we're on the right side, so just insert into the tip of the column over the step, and then simply work 1 more slip stitch, or however many slip stitches you need to get to along the baseline to the corner of where that first motif joins. So here I can only work 1. But if you actually started with 191 stitches in your border, then you should be able to work a couple, 2 or 3. And that's it. So once you've kind of tucked this motif into the corner of the other motif, just cut the yarn, just leaving a little bit of extra because we're going to do a tiny bit of sewing. So this first motif we worked it on half of it was on a chain, so it's kind of like flapping, and we just want to kind of tack it down so that it overlaps and is attached to the motif we just finished. And that's it. It's very simple, just really a couple of whip stitches on the back here with the right sides facing each other is all you need to do. It's a bit messy looking. Exactly what loops I'm going into is anyone's guess, but I'm trying to avoid going into like the middle loops because those are going to be visible on the right side. So I'm just kind of going into like some peripheral loops. And I'm checking periodically from the front to see if I really need to keep going. You're just trying to tack down that loose edge. So really that's enough stitches sewn. I just need to sort of tighten that little join. So just pull down and you see how that first motif nicely tightens itself up flush against the overlapping last motif that you just worked. And then I'm just weaving in the end here. And we'll look at it from the right side. Now, because I didn't have the right number of stitches, it's not going to be perfect. If you sort of rotate around and look at the other motifs and then you go back, it jumps out at you. It's conspicuous. It's a little different. It's angled funny. There it is. But again, I think it's good enough for government. For me, it's not worth starting again with my whole border. So as promised, there are some simpler borders you can do. The slip stitch one I just worked takes a long time to work, and it adds a lot of size to your placemat. So here are two simple ones that you can do. I'll show the left one first. I learned this in a Tunisian crochet video. Actually, it's really simple and I really like it. So start by chaining 2 and then work a double crochet into the same stitch. So wherever you did your invisible join. Skip a stitch and then work a slip stitch into the next stitch. And that's the repeat. Chain 2, double crochet into the same stitch, skip 1 stitch along your baseline, and work a slip stitch into the next stitch. And keep repeating that. Chain 2, double crochet into the same stitch, skip a stitch, and slip stitch into the baseline. And keep repeating that. That's the repeat. So it is a very, very simple thing. It doesn't add much size. So if you're pretty happy with the size of your placemat and you don't want to make it too much bigger, this is a good choice. I actually think it's really cute. Don't ask why I am using this weird little sample where I only worked baseline for a certain distance. This is a work in progress, and I didn't want to start a whole new placemat just to demonstrate these other borders. So I'm just using a different project, but that is what this border looks like. Here it is on a different project that was worked in Tunisian crochet that I'm going to make a video for as well. It's quite cute and simple. Here it is in green. So the other tried and true border that I've used on all of my placemat patterns a million times, it can be worked on a circle, an oval, it's very flexible, is just fan stitch. So work a single crochet in place after your invisible join, skip 2 stitches, and then work 5 double crochets into the next stitch. Skip 2 stitches and work a single crochet or a slip stitch into the next stitch, and then repeat that. So here I am working 5 double crochets into the same stitch, 5, and then you would skip 2 stitches and work a single crochet, and you just go around. So that was a long one. I hope this video helped you with completing this pattern. I'll remind you once again to take it for free from my website if you are interested. Thank you for watching.